December 4th, 1872. The Atlantic Ocean, cold and restless, somewhere between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. The crew of the British brigantine Dei Grazia spots a ship in the distance. At first, there is nothing extraordinary about it. Merchant vessels cross these waters all the time. But as the Dei Grazia draws closer, Captain David Morehouse notices something strange. The ship is not sailing normally. Her sails are set, but poorly trimmed. Some hang loose, others are damaged. She yaws awkwardly in the wind, not under command, but not completely abandoned to the sea either. It is the movement of a ship that should have people aboard, but somehow doesn't. Morehouse recognizes the vessel. It is the Mary Celeste. That recognition makes the sight even more unsettling. He knows her captain, Benjamin Briggs, not by reputation alone, but personally. The two men had recently been in New York at the same time before departing on their separate voyages. Briggs was known as steady, careful, deeply experienced. Not the kind of captain who would let his ship wander helplessly through the Atlantic. So Morehouse orders a boarding party. A small boat is lowered. Men row across rough water and climb aboard the silent vessel. What they find becomes one of the most famous mysteries in maritime history. The Mary Celeste is deserted. No captain, no crew, no passengers. And yet the ship is still afloat, still capable of sailing, still carrying its cargo. In the hold are 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, Italy. In the cabins are clothes, personal items, and the ordinary remains of life at sea. Captain Briggs's wife had been traveling with him, so had their young daughter. Their belongings are still there. The ship's lifeboat is missing, so are some essential navigational instruments. But there are no bodies, no bloodstains, no signs of violent struggle, and no obvious reason why 10 people would leave a vessel that was, by all appearances, still survivable. The last entry in the ship's log is days old. When she is found, the Mary Celeste has apparently been drifting, or rather sailing herself, for more than a week. A vessel intact, a crew vanished, a family gone without a trace. For more than a century and a half, the question has remained the same. What happened aboard the Mary Celeste? Part 1. The ship before the mystery. The Mary Celeste did not begin her life under that name. She was built in 1861 at Spencer's Island in Nova Scotia and launched as the Amazon. She was a brigantine, a two-masted merchant vessel designed for long voyages and cargo work. By the standards of the time, she was not enormous, but she was respectable. Sturdy, practical, and suited to the Atlantic trade. Almost immediately, stories of misfortune began to gather around her. One of her first captains, Robert McClellan, died shortly after taking command. During her early years, the ship suffered a string of accidents, collisions, storm damage, and groundings. In a less romantic retelling, these incidents were not evidence of a curse. 19th century merchant shipping was dangerous, and ships were damaged constantly. But hindsight has a way of arranging ordinary bad luck into a pattern. By 1867, after being badly damaged in a storm and abandoned, the Amazon was recovered and sold. She eventually passed into American ownership, was rebuilt, and renamed the Mary Celeste. The new name seemed to promise a new chapter. In practice, it gave the vessel the identity under which she would become immortal. In 1872, she was part-owned by James H. Winchester, a New York merchant involved in shipping. He appointed Benjamin Spooner Briggs as master. Briggs was 37 years old and, by every serious account, a highly competent captain. He came from a Massachusetts seafaring family and had spent much of his life at sea. He was known as intelligent, disciplined, sober, and religious. Friends and relatives regarded him as cautious rather than reckless. He was the sort of man merchants trusted with valuable cargo, and the sort of man families trusted with their lives. On this voyage, he would command not only his crew but also his own family. His wife, Sarah, would accompany him. So would their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda. Their young son, Arthur, stayed behind with relatives, likely because the voyage would be long and difficult. This detail is important. The Mary Celeste was not simply a working ship crossing the Atlantic with cargo and hired sailors. For Briggs, this was also a temporary home. That makes the decision to abandon it, if that is what happened, all the more difficult to explain. The crew selected for the voyage appears to have been experienced and generally well regarded. Surviving records list first mate Albert Richardson, second mate Andrew Gilling, steward Edward Head, and several German seamen, including brothers Volkert and Boz Lorenzen. There is no strong evidence that the crew was mutinous, criminal, or unusually unstable. In fact, Briggs reportedly chose them with care. Their cargo was 1,701 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol. Not the kind intended for drinking, but a commercial spirit meant for industrial use. It was valuable, volatile, and potentially dangerous under the right conditions. The destination was Genoa. The departure port was New York. The date was November 7, 1872. Around the same time, Captain Morehouse and the Dei Grazia were also preparing to sail. The two captains knew each other. Some later accounts would exaggerate the intimacy of their relationship, but it is clear they moved in overlapping maritime circles and were acquainted enough to make the later discovery feel personal. On November 7th, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor. Bad weather delayed the Dei Grazia, which departed later on November 15th. That separation in time would matter. It helps explain how one ship could later overtake the other in the Atlantic. For the Mary Celeste, the voyage began as countless Atlantic voyages had before it. Cold weather, strong winds, long watches, wet decks, the endless routine of sail handling, navigation, and maintenance. Nothing about the first stage of the trip clearly suggested disaster. Part 2. A vanishing in the Atlantic. To understand why the case remains so haunting, it helps to focus not on what we imagine happened, but on what is actually known. The most important known source is the ship's log. The final entry was made on the morning of November 25, 1872. It placed the Mary Celeste near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The weather was rough but not extraordinary for the North Atlantic in late autumn. After that, the record ends. There is no final message, no explanation, no dramatic farewell written by a doomed captain. And then, on December 4th, the Dei Grazia encounters the vessel about 400 nautical miles east of the Azores. The ship is alive in the most mechanical sense, but everyone aboard is gone. When the boarding party inspects the Mary Celeste, they find a set of details that seem almost designed to resist interpretation. The vessel is not in perfect condition. Some sails are torn, some rigging is loose. The ship has taken on water, but not an amount that should have doomed her. Reports vary slightly, as historical reports often do, but the quantity found in the bilge was significant without being fatal. It was the kind of situation a working crew would normally manage, not a reason to flee in blind panic from a seaworthy vessel. The pumps are one of the more debated details. At least one was reportedly disassembled or not functioning properly, and if Captain Briggs believed the ship was taking on more water than it actually was, that could have influenced his judgment. But even this is not straightforward. Merchant ships of the era often dealt with unreliable equipment. The evidence suggests inconvenience and uncertainty, not necessarily catastrophe. Below deck, the scene is stranger precisely because it is so ordinary. The cabins contain clothing and personal items. Briggs's papers are mostly present, though some key documents are missing. The crew's effects are still there. Food stores and water supplies remain ample. Nothing suggests the desperate stripping of a doomed ship. There are no obvious signs of violence. No blood. No major damage consistent with combat. No evidence of pirates ransacking cabins or looting the cargo. The cargo itself is largely intact. This matters because cargo is motive. If pirates had boarded the ship for profit, the alcohol should have been an obvious prize. Instead, the barrels are still in the hold. However, later inspection found that several barrels were empty or leaking. 9, according to the commonly cited figure. And these were not necessarily built like the others. Some historians note that the leaking barrels were made of red oak, a wood more porous than the white oak used for most of the shipment. That detail, obscure as it sounds, may be central to the entire mystery. Another crucial clue is what is missing: The lifeboat is gone. A sounding rod is reportedly missing. The sextant and marine chronometer, essential instruments for determining position, are gone as well. Some ship's papers are missing too. That combination strongly suggests that the people aboard did not simply disappear by accident. They appear to have left deliberately and in some degree of order. They took the boat. They took navigational tools. They may have intended to return. A rope trailing from the ship or evidence that such a line had been used has also figured in reconstructions of the case. If true, it supports the possibility that the lifeboat was meant to remain tethered alongside or behind the vessel while the crew waited out a perceived danger. This is where the mystery narrows, not to certainty but to a smaller number of possibilities. If the Mary Celeste had been attacked, why was nothing valuable taken? If there was mutiny, why were the captain's valuables left behind? And why was the ship not redirected to some safer or more profitable destination? If a storm swept everyone overboard, why was the lifeboat missing? And why were the navigational instruments gone too? Every clue seems to reject the most dramatic answer. And yet the final picture is still terrifying, because the likeliest explanation may be the quietest one. Part 3. The investigation in Gibraltar. After finding the ship, the crew of the Dei Grazia faced a difficult decision. Salvage law offered a powerful incentive to bring abandoned ships into port. A successful salvage could mean a substantial reward. But salvaging a mystery was not the same as salvaging ordinary property. An abandoned ship with 10 missing people invited suspicion. Even so, Morehouse divided his crew. A salvage party was placed aboard the Mary Celeste and ordered to sail her to Gibraltar, the nearest major British port where the matter could be investigated officially. That alone was no easy task. Handling a large sailing vessel with only a skeleton crew is dangerous even in fair conditions. Yet they managed it. Once in Gibraltar, authorities opened an inquiry under the supervision of Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General for Gibraltar. Solly Flood has not aged well in historical memory. He seems to have been suspicious by temperament and, perhaps, attracted to the possibility of uncovering a sensational crime. Rather than beginning from the assumption that the Mary Celeste people had abandoned ship in fear or confusion, he appears to have entertained darker possibilities. Had the crew of the Dei Grazia murdered those aboard and staged the abandonment? Had Benjamin Briggs and his own men become involved in mutiny, insurance fraud, or drunken violence? Had the cargo concealed some criminal scheme? Investigators inspected the ship minutely. They examined cut marks on the railings. They studied stains. They reviewed the cargo. They interviewed witnesses. At one stage, Solly Flood placed weight on the presence of marks that he thought might be blood. Later examinations suggested otherwise. He also pursued theories involving swords and foul play, but the evidence was weak. The problem for the investigation was the same problem that still defines the mystery today. There was not enough evidence to prove a crime, but there was enough strangeness to make a simple explanation feel inadequate. No one could show that the Dei Grazia crew had attacked the Mary Celeste. There was no credible sign that pirates had taken her. There was no body, no confession, no missing treasure, and no practical motive that fit the facts. In the end, the inquiry failed to solve the case. The Mary Celeste was released. The cargo was eventually delivered, and the salvors did receive payment, but much less than they had expected, likely because suspicion lingered and officials were unwilling to reward them too generously in such a troubling case. That unsatisfying conclusion helped preserve the mystery. A solved disappearance becomes history. An unsolved one becomes folklore. Part 4. The myth takes over. Part of what makes the Mary Celeste so famous is that the historical case did not remain historical for very long. It was rapidly transformed into a story, and stories do what evidence rarely does. They add detail. Perhaps the most influential distortion came in 1884, when Arthur Conan Doyle, years before Sherlock Holmes would make him internationally famous, published a short story inspired by the case. He changed the ship's name slightly to the Marie Celeste and invented a tale of violence, exotic motives, and a lone survivor. It was fiction, but it was vivid fiction. and many readers either misunderstood that fact or absorbed its invented details into their memory of the real event. Over time, the Mary Celeste acquired a mythology all its own. There was said to be a half-eaten meal on the table, a cup of tea still warm, a cat prowling the decks, a sewing machine threaded as though someone had just stood up from it, a clock still ticking in the silence. Some of these details contain small fragments of truth. Others were embellished. Some were simply invented. The trouble is that the myth is better television than the reality. And once a false detail becomes famous, it is repeated because it feels right. The real case is less theatrical. There is no solid historical basis for the warm meal, the steaming tea, or the sudden interruption of breakfast. Time had passed. The ship had been exposed to weather. The discovery was eerie enough without adding fictional props. But in another sense, the truth is more disturbing. The Mary Celeste was not a frozen tableau of panic. It was a functioning vessel whose people seemed to have made a conscious decision and then vanished beyond recovery. That is harder to dramatize. It is also harder to dismiss. The ship became a blank screen onto which each generation projected its own fears. In the late 19th century, the sea was still a frontier vast enough to absorb whole communities and return nothing. In the 20th, the case invited comparisons to ghost ships, paranormal phenomena, sea monsters, and unexplained forces. In the age of mass media, mystery became commodity, and so the Mary Celeste drifted from archive into legend. Not because the evidence demanded supernatural explanations, but because the absence of certainty created room for them. Part 5. The serious theories. If we strip away the folklore, what explanations remain? Surprisingly, not many, and the most credible of them are mundane in a way that makes the ending even sadder. The theory favored by many historians centers on the alcohol cargo. Industrial alcohol produces vapor. Under certain conditions, those vapors can accumulate in confined spaces. If enough pressure builds, or if ignition occurs, the result may be a flash fire or violent blast. Importantly, such an event does not always leave the classic signs people expect from a major explosion. It can be brief, frightening, and difficult to interpret afterward. If several barrels were leaking during rough weather, the hold may have filled intermittently with vapor. Captain Briggs, already dealing with poor weather and a ship taking on some water, might have smelled fumes or heard a loud report from below. To a captain responsible not only for cargo and crew but for his wife and child, that would present a brutal decision. Stay aboard a vessel that may be moments from exploding, or temporarily abandon it until the danger becomes clearer. In modern imagination, abandoning a large ship into a small boat sounds absurd, but fear changes the scale of risk. A captain who believes the ship may blow apart beneath him might see the lifeboat not as a death trap, but as the only rational short-term shelter. According to this reconstruction, Briggs ordered everyone into the boat, taking the chronometer, sextant, and other essential tools. A line may have been attached so that the lifeboat could tow astern at a distance while still remaining linked to the ship. They would wait until the fumes dispersed. Then they would return. If that is what happened, the fatal moment may have been small.
A sudden gust.
A squall. A poorly secured line snapping under tension. The Mary Celeste, under partial sail and unmanned, would continue moving away. The lifeboat, low in the water and heavily loaded with 10 people, would fall behind. Within minutes, the distance becomes impossible. Voices vanish in the wind. A rope disappears beneath waves, and the ship that was meant to be their refuge sails on without them. In the North Atlantic, in late November, in an open boat, the odds would be merciless. Exposure, dehydration, swamping, capsize. Even if they survived for hours or days, rescue would depend on luck so extreme it might as well be none at all. This theory explains many of the facts. Why the cargo remained, why there was no violence, why the lifeboat and instruments were missing, why the ship itself was not destroyed, why no one was ever found. It does not explain everything, cannot tell us exactly what Briggs saw, smelled, or feared, but it fits the evidence more closely than most rivals. Another theory focuses on faulty measurements of water in the hold. If Briggs used a sounding rod and found what seemed to be a dangerous level of flooding, he might have concluded that the pumps were failing and the ship was sinking slowly. Combined with bad weather and cargo concerns, that perception could have triggered abandonment. Some historians suggest a combination rather than a single cause. Not one dramatic event, but several moderate threats arriving at once. Rough seas, a malfunctioning pump, uncertainty about the water level, leaking alcohol fumes, and concern for family aboard. Under such circumstances, temporary evacuation might have seemed prudent. And then there are the more sensational theories. Piracy is one of the oldest and one of the weakest. Pirates motivated by profit do not usually leave a valuable cargo untouched, spare money and jewelry in the cabins, and politely take only the lifeboat. Mutiny is also unlikely. There is no convincing evidence of conflict between Briggs and his crew. No clear motive. No attempt to profit from the ship. No reports of suspicious crew behavior prior to departure. And if mutineers had seized the vessel, it is hard to explain why they would then abandon a perfectly usable ship in mid-ocean. Insurance fraud occasionally appears in retellings, especially because the ship's later final voyage in 1885 really did end in a fraudulent grounding off Haiti. But projecting that later crime backward onto 1872 is not persuasive. There is no strong evidence that Benjamin Briggs or the ship's owners planned such a scheme, and the risks would have been absurdly high, especially with Briggs's own family aboard. Then come the theories that endure mostly because mystery creates appetite. Sea monsters, water spouts, submarine earthquakes, alien abduction, curses, temporal anomalies. These explanations survive not because they solve the case, but because they convert uncertainty into spectacle. The Mary Celeste does not need them. Its documented facts are already haunting enough. Part 6. The human factor. When people discuss the Mary Celeste, the missing people often collapse into a single category: the vanished crew. But the reality was more intimate. These were individuals with families, histories, and expectations for the future. Benjamin Briggs was not a reckless adventurer wandering into danger for excitement. He was an established captain making a routine commercial voyage. Sarah Briggs was not a fictional ghost in a captain's cabin. She was a real woman who wrote letters, kept a household, and chose or accepted the life that maritime families often had to live. Sophia was a toddler. Whatever happened, she did not understand it. This is one reason the likely explanation feels so severe. If the abandonment theory is correct, then the final catastrophe may have emerged from an attempt to protect them. A captain doing the cautious thing. A father choosing temporary distance from a potentially explosive cargo. A decision sensible enough in the moment to win the agreement of everyone aboard. Then suddenly the geometry changes. A ship under sail is faster than panic. By the time you know the line has parted, the mistake is no longer correctable. It is easy, with hindsight, to ask why they did not simply remain aboard. But hindsight lives on dry land. At sea, knowledge is partial, instruments are imperfect, and decisions are made in wind, darkness, noise, fatigue, and fear. The Mary Celeste mystery has endured partly because it tempts us to think there must have been a dramatic hidden cause. But maritime history is full of disasters created by ordinary uncertainty. The sea does not require monsters. It only requires one wrong judgment at the wrong time. Part 7. What happened to the ship? The fate of the Mary Celeste after 1872 is less mysterious, but in its own way almost as strange. One might imagine that a vessel associated with such notoriety would be retired, broken up, or avoided. Instead, she returned to commercial service. The ship continued sailing for more than a decade. She changed hands more than once and moved through the Atlantic and Caribbean trades. Her name had become famous, but fame does not automatically remove a ship from circulation. In the practical world of merchants and captains, a vessel was an asset until it no longer paid. Then, in 1885, came the end. Captain Gilman C. Parker deliberately ran the Mary Celeste aground on Rochelois Reef off the coast of Haiti in an attempted insurance fraud. The scheme failed. Investigators recognized the deception. The cargo involved was of little value. The wreck was left to the sea. There is a bitter irony in that ending. After surviving one of the most famous unsolved disappearances in history, the Mary Celeste did not sink in a storm or vanish into a legend. She died in a clumsy fraud. Over time, the remains were broken apart and lost. Whatever physical traces the vessel might still have carried from 1872 disappeared with them. So the central evidence is gone. What remains are documents, testimony, later reconstructions, and the silence between them. Part 8. Why the Mary Celeste endures. There are many maritime disasters with higher death tolls, clearer drama, and greater historical importance. Yet the Mary Celeste occupies a unique place in the imagination. Why? Because most sea tragedies end with a body of evidence that matches the disaster. A wreck beneath waves, bodies on shore, a storm in the log, debris fields, witnesses. The Mary Celeste offers something different. It presents aftermath without event, a conclusion without an observed cause. The ship is the final chapter, but the previous pages are gone. Human beings are especially vulnerable to this kind of mystery. When something disappears completely, the mind resists the void. It looks for shape, plot, intention, a final scene. We do not like open endings, especially when the setting is a place as indifferent and immense as the ocean. A house with no occupants is unsettling. A car abandoned on a roadside raises questions. But a ship moving under sail mid-ocean with no one aboard, that feels almost impossible. It seems to violate the expected relationship between people and machines, between action and actor. Yet that is exactly what ships can do. They can keep moving after the human story has ended. That is part of what makes ghost ships so powerful. They are not supernatural objects. They are normal machines continuing their function after something has gone wrong with the people. In the case of the Mary Celeste, that continuing motion becomes almost symbolic. For days, perhaps more than a week, she sailed on, her crew gone, her destination unchanged, the sea and wind performing the labor of 10 vanished people. There is something unbearable in that image, not because it suggests magic, but because it suggests indifference. The world does not stop when people disappear. The ship keeps going. The cargo remains stacked in the hold. The compass continues to point north. The waves continue exactly as before, and the names begin to detach from their bodies and enter history. Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, Sophia Matilda Briggs, Albert Richardson, Andrew Gilling, Edward Head, Volkert Lorenzen, Boz Lorenzen, Arian Martins, Gottlieb Gutschad. 10 people, reduced by the absence of evidence to a list and a question. Closing. So what happened aboard the Mary Celeste? The most likely answer is also the least theatrical. A prudent captain, worried by a combination of leaking alcohol fumes, rough weather, malfunctioning equipment, and uncertain flooding, ordered a temporary evacuation. A lifeboat was lowered. Essential instruments were taken. A tow line was fixed. Then something went wrong. The line parted, or the sea separated them another way. And the Mary Celeste, no longer carrying the people who gave her purpose, sailed out of reach. We cannot prove that. There is no surviving witness, no recovered boat, no final log entry, no discovered skeletons on some forgotten shore. Only probabilities, but perhaps that is enough. Not enough to satisfy curiosity completely, not enough to silence the mythology, but enough to glimpse the shape of the tragedy. Not a supernatural event, not a pirate attack, not a conspiracy, just the ocean, uncertainty, and a decision made under pressure. And maybe that is why the story remains so powerful. Because if the mystery were solved by something extraordinary, it would become easier to contain. Instead, the likeliest explanation is frighteningly ordinary. A competent captain, a reasonable precaution, a small failure, and then nothing. On December 4th, 1872, the men of the Dei Grazia stepped onto a ship that should not have been empty. They looked into cabins where life had been interrupted. They walked decks that still answered the wind. And somewhere behind them, beyond the horizon, the truth had already sunk. The ocean kept it, as it keeps almost everything,